Hi everyone, welcome to a new Math Skills Live Q&A. This time we are answering questions about architecture. I'm Manuel Vivo and I'll be the host for this session today. With me I have...
Hi, my name is Yiğit Boyar. I work in the Android Toolkit team.
Hi, I'm TJ. I'm a developer relations engineer.
Hey all, my name is Milos and I'm Android Developers Relations Engineer as well.
Awesome, thank you everyone for joining. You can start asking questions using our YouTube chat. And while you're at it, feel free to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it already. Meanwhile, we're going to start with some questions you already asked us on Twitter and our YouTube episodes. First question to warm up, this is a classic one. I know you love it. Is live data deprecated?
I love this. I love this question because I think that's the only reason I'm invited. So let's keep that coming. But the answer is still no. We still don't have a reason to do that. So if you're using live data, you're happy with it, keep using it. That being said, we have one of the reasons people use live data is there's certain APIs that are only available in live data, like getting an easy observable safe state object. We have added new APIs there where they also work with Stateflow now. So one by one, we are making sure our API surface for coroutines and flow is first class. So if you want to be there, be our guest, but you have a reason to stay in live data, you can stay there. I think you are safe for foreseeable future.
Cool. Sounds great. Thank you. Next question is probably for TJ. What is business logic? What is the motivation behind moving business logic down to the data layer?
That's a great question. But to give an answer, so business logic is kind of what gives value to your app, right? It's everything is a set of rules that determines how your app behaves. For example, if you had an app that displayed news articles and you hit the bookmark button, the interactions that go from bookmarking the article and persisting that is your business logic. Now, as to why you would want to move that down to the data layer, the reason you'd want to do that is you'd want to have a single source of truth for the state in your apps. So this way, if you move, like for example, we use business logic bookmarking as an example. If you put that in your data layer with a repository, any screen or any part of your app that needs that information has a single place to get it from, the news repository. So that, as well as managing concurrency, reusability, are all fantastic reasons for you to move your business logic into the data layer.
Cool, great answer, thank you. Next question is gonna be this one we got from Twitter as well. How to access resources like strings, colors, etc. in the view model, as we should not link the context to it. Milos, probably you can take this one.
Yeah, let me take this one. So basically, you shouldn't. Accessing resources is supposed to happen in the UI layer only. So either views or composable. You can expose a resource ID in a view model, but you should never access resources directly inside a VM.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah, I'd like to add something there. Like the reason why you have these resources there is because oftentimes the resource changes based on the configuration, and that configuration is only available when you are in the UI. Like whether you are in dark mode or light mode doesn't mean any sense outside the UI. So it's the reason why you want to limit that access in your UI classes.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
I think there's also one more reason. It's that context has a different life cycle than a view model. And by passing context to a view model, we might risk leaking it.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Next question. How do I make a service and a composable or view model communicate to each other? Probably I think I can answer this one, because I think you shouldn't make them communicate to each other directly, like making them hold a reference to each other, for example. Instead, I would use the same instance of a different class, properly scoped, that will act as the source of truth, as TJ was saying before, for the data that is needed. Like typically, this class might be a repository that you can call from the service or the view model to change some state. And then the other class would get the updates automatically when using streams of data. But definitely, I wouldn't hold a reference to a context, as Milos was saying, or any app component, for example, service or activity in the view model. Mhm. Cool. This one is might be quite interesting for you. What are the best practices now to allow a smooth future transition to KMP, Kotlin multi-platform?
So this is a tough question because usually like best practices get established over time. So you need to see like enough people trying and failing to understand what is the right way to do things. So like I will answer this with a grain of salt, but like ideally all of the guidance we provide in DAG actually sets you up for this. For example, the things TJ mentioned before about like moving your business logic into a data layer, which usually the least relevant part with respect to Android, like you don't end up calling too many Android APIs there. That's a good start. So if you follow that, as these components become available in Kotlin multi-platform, you will be able to swap them like like your database. But also, just for the sake of being ready for Kotlin multi-platform, don't start abstracting your code base. Like, unless you have a very clear plan on how to implement it in other platforms and go there, don't try to do that work today because you don't know what will change between today and the day you can actually start using Kotlin multi-platform. Like, it's a very new technology. It's very promising. We are looking into it, but if you cannot see end-to-end, don't just like add a bunch of abstraction in your code base for no actual benefit. Yeah, I think that's all I would advise.
Cool, nice. Next question. It's what is the view model in MVVM? Since view model is just supposed to be a stakeholder, what classes does it actually map to? TJ, maybe?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the one reason I like this question is the answer is right there in it. So when you ask what is the view model in MVVM, the view model is just the stakeholder. That's exactly right. The VM in MVVM is the stakeholder. Now the thing about this is that the class it maps to really depends on the context. If your composable or whatever thing is backing your view, whether it's the Android view system or you're using Compose, the VM for it, or the stakeholder for it, if it's a navigation destination, you probably want to use the Android architecture view model class. If it's a bit of reusable UI, an example of a reusable UI, for example, might be if you had a chip group and you just wanted to select a couple of chips, or even a search bar, or anything that is reusable, the stakeholder for it may just be a plain class. So again, it really depends on the scope of the UI in question, whether it's navigation scoped, or whether it's a small piece of reusable UI that can be used in multiple or different contexts. The stakeholder is the VM in MVVM, where the stakeholder could be a view model, as you've pointed out, or a plain class.
Yeah, usually we recommend view models as kind of like a special type of stakeholders for like screen level. It could be like a screen, a destination of navigation, or something like that. But if Steve was saying, like, if you want to reuse a piece of UI, don't make it a view model because the scope is not gonna work out in the end. Cool. Next question. Regarding to architecture, is there any updates or recommendations related to multi-module projects by layers, like the architecture samples? Milos?
Right. Wow. Thanks for that. We are actually currently working on such guidance, and we hope to release it this year. So if you are interested in modular programming, stay tuned. We hear you, and I assure you that we are working on that.
Yeah, it's a very exciting topic as well, modularization. We have a community episode made by Emily, and it was great. It was just a sneak peek, just a 2-minute video, but definitely great in case you want to check it out. Cool. Next question. It's should we use Flow in data sources and repositories, interactors, or use cases? Wants to take this one? TJ?
Okay. I could take that. So you should use flows where they best fit. Now, if you have a data source that produces data, whether that data is back from the network, something like a network response that is a single shot response, a suspending function might make sense. However, if it's backed by like a database like Room, for example, you probably want to use flow or paging source or anything that can show that this changes values over time. For your repositories, now since your repository in our ArchDocs, we mentioned that the repositories handle conflicts and whether it comes from, it also handles the data liaisons, whether the data is coming from the database or from the network, and merging those, given those values can change over time. You also probably want to use a flow for this because that's what it is. A flow is a sequence of values that changes over time. So you should use flows where they most make sense, where they're most appropriate, provided that whatever it is that you're reflecting or reading can change over time. In other words, is stream-like. Probably want to use a flow for this.
Yeah, definitely. Next question, when to use cases? Probably I can take this one. Our team defined use cases in like to solve like two different problems. The first problem it wants to use is reusing business logic that otherwise would be in the view model. So let's say you have some bits of business logic that you want to use in multiple screens. In that case, instead of repeating the same logic in all view models, you could create a use case, introduce the domain layer to actually accomplish that behavior. And the other use case, sorry for the redundancy here, it's whenever you want to reduce the complexity in one view model class. Let's say you are combining multiple repositories, you have like a huge view model class, you can extract out like a complex piece of that functionality into a use case to make it easier to test and actually makes the view model easier to read and go through. So yeah, definitely those are the main two reasons why you would want to add a domain layer to your app and use use cases.
Manuel, if I can, I think there is one more really nice advantage of using use cases. If your view model depends on use cases instead of repositories, just by looking at the declaration and the constructor arguments of a view model, you can easily see what the view model is going to do. I think that's a nice added benefit.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Cool. Next question we have, it's passing cascading suspend functions in repositories. Is that an anti-pattern in Android MVVM with Flow?
That's an interesting thing. What's a cascading suspend?
I assume
I was wondering that
calling a lot of suspend functions, right? From to the repository, to the data source, and all the way down to, I don't know, to a system resource or something. I don't think it is, to be honest. I mean, it's just how coroutines work. It is not an anti-pattern for sure. As TJ was saying before, like if you want to make one-shot operations, you might want to use suspend functions. Otherwise, you should be using flows. That's those are kind of the APIs that the data layer, for example, exposes. Suspend functions or flows or functions returning flows.
Yeah. So I have a guess here. I don't know what it means, but maybe this is relevant to like how you would model these if you're using, let's say, RxJava, where you need to model it as a reactive stream because that's the only way to do it. Versus in coroutines, you have suspend functions. So there's no reason to complicate that code. It's fine to be calling suspend functions around.
That's good. Okay, next question. What is the recommended pattern for a view model to tell the UI to navigate to a different fragment or screen? Tia, you want to take this one? I don't want to talk that much.
Sure. For telling a view model to navigate or to go to a screen, so one of the things we've done in the architecture guidance is we've kind of condensed the guidance for, we have things we call UI events and so on. But the important thing is that whether it's a UI event or whether it's something like you use to actually build your UI, we want to keep everything in a state object. So if you wanted to navigate to a screen from your view model, the best thing you probably want to do again is keep it in the state, and then once the UI has received that event, remove it from your state. So we actually have a really, in the UI events guidance on DAC, we actually have a great example of this. You could, again, it really depends on, you could have a couple of ways of modeling this. You could do this as a Boolean, or you could actually put it as, so if you had a list of messages that the UI could consume, and then you send a navigation event, the UI receives a navigation event, and it tells the view model, okay, I've received this event, and the view model removes that event. So you don't have the unfortunate trampoline experience where like you navigate somewhere, you then come back, and then you have this sticky item that forces you, that just keeps bouncing you off like a trampoline. But our UI events guidance is a great resource to figure out how to do this.
Also, like something that like when you, it's like a very common examples of this. Let's say the user logged in, and then you want to send the user to the home screen. Instead of thinking that, oh, I need an event to send the user to the home screen, is actually a state change, right? Like you're in the login screen, and the user state changed from not logged in to logged in. So you just make your state change, and then your login UI knows that, well, I have no business, I'm already logged in, let's move to the next screen. Now, this doesn't work for repeatable events, but for this kind of final states, there's actually just, so when you need this event, try to model it as a state. Oftentimes, that will be a straightforward solution. And if not, like what TJ mentioned, is so like then you have a state of pending navigation events. So again, it becomes a state, like the default transformation.
Yeah, UI events is probably the most controversial topic we've been hearing from since we published the guidance in December.
Yeah.
And I often I'm in Twitter, asking, well, actually like answering some questions, why you do that? Why is that too complicated? And I think that the main point here, and probably like an aha moment for some people, is that I wouldn't think about those commands as events. Like if we take a step back, like that state from the view model, it just represents application state, as it was saying before. It's like, it is not about telling the UI to do certain things. It's about the view model saying, hey, this is the application state. And if that becomes an event or a command for the UI, that's a whole different thing. And for example, like TJ was mentioning about as well, like telling the view model again that the event was consumed. I wouldn't think about it in that way. Like if you think about it, it's like, for example, like the user seeing a message displayed on the screen. I like to think about it like whenever the message is displayed, there is a state change, and the state change is that the message was consumed by the user. And that's why the view or the UI has to communicate to the view model, hey, the user has seen this message. So I will try to not use the event word here. It's more about like how application state or how the state of the app changes over time. And that definitely should be modeled as part of a state. Cool. Okay, this was a great question. It's probably my favorite topic. I spent so much time discussing this online. Anyway, okay, next question. How to define conditional navigation graph based on user configuration? Anyone wants to answer?
I think the interesting things about questions like this is understanding the intent behind the question. Because when they say user configuration, in what context do they mean? What is user configuration in this context?
Is it about conditional navigation, maybe?
Yeah, probably. Like, is the user logged in or not? Is that coming from a, do you have a token, like a valid token in your preferences or not? It's conditional navigation, right?
I see. Okay, gotcha. So depending on, so I guess the user status rather than user configuration, the state of the app. Well, if that's the question, then I think we kind of somewhat answered it in the previous question, right? Where, you have, if you have your, so with your navigation graph, you have nested, you could have nested graphs or different graphs mapped to different situations your app may be in. So for example, you could have so assuming the user configuration or user statuses of this in context right now are logged in, logged out, then you could just have, representations for your logged in or logged out states and have a nav graph defined for that. And when those state changes, you just swap the you just swap out the nav graph appropriately depending on the status of that flag.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Works for me. Okay. Next question. Actually, I saw two similar questions for the same topic, and it's about where should we put Work Manager and services in our architecture?
I love this question, but I don't want to hog the mic.
Yeah.
I can chime in.
Yeah.
You want to give it a shot?
Yeah, I wasn't sure what does it mean. Where should we put Work Manager and services? But like this kind of in your like lower than business layer or like as part of your business layer too. And it's very Android specific in that case. But oftentimes, like if you're maybe this is about like unbundled from the Android framework APIs. I don't know, but if that's the case, like oftentimes we find ourselves writing these like Work Manager workers, which basically calls another repository API to do something. So that like it's only so Work Manager is very specific to Android because there's a lot of built-in logic, assuming that this is running on an Android device, like with all the battery savings or like Wi-Fi connection, whatnot. So you still need to use it for that. But after that, the worker is pretty much like a straightforward class that makes another function call into your application's business logic to execute that action.
Yeah. Something I could add to that, for example, is right. So with Work Manager, we make the distinction between persistent work and one-time work, right? So as for where like Work Manager fits in, for example, let's use a common app, Twitter. You post a tweet, but as you're posting the tweet is uploading the video or something, and you're going to leave the app, right? For something like that could take some amount of time, you definitely want to use Work Manager for this. Another great thing about Work Manager is that Work Manager has inbuilt exponential backoff. So if, for example, you set up Work Manager and you give it a constraint that this action can only happen when there's internet access, and then you queue the work and Work Manager starts doing the work, and then for whatever reason you lose internet access. Just for a brief second, you're in a train, the train goes into a tunnel, and you've lost internet connectivity. Well, because Work Manager has inbuilt exponential backoff, the minute you're out of that tunnel and you have internet connection again, Work Manager will retry this. So like Yeet says, Work Manager is Android specific, and ultimately all Work Manager ever does is call back into your own code. Now, for the kind of code it should call back into, it really depends on if the work you want to do is persistent work, recurring work, or deferred work that should only happen maybe when the user is asleep, like uploading logs or that sort of thing. But again, Work Manager is very Android specific. It could fit anywhere in your Android architecture. It really depends on the work that the worker is supposed to do. Sorry about the tautology and redundancy in that statement.
But I'm not sure if this is a confusing topic, but just to clarify, Work Manager is not something to run work that doesn't need to be persistent. So you only use Work Manager for things that needs to happen even if your application is restarted or whatnot. So like, if you're going into AI and just want to fetch users tweets, don't put it into Work Manager. Just do regular coroutines.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Talking about coroutines, next question. Why would you use IO Dispatcher in repository to access the database sometimes and sometimes not?
Maybe I can take this one. So the way, so at least from the Room's perspective, Room already supports having suspend functions in your DAO, and then these suspend functions automatically move the work into a background executor thread that Room has, which you can configure. So if you're calling a suspend function like that, as long as you are in a suspend function, you don't need to do anything, like just let Room handle. But maybe you have another, so whenever you can do that. That's the right way to go. So that like all of your database operations are pulled into the threads controlled by Room to minimize like them fighting each other for resources because they're accessing the same file. In terms of, so if you have a case, let's say you cannot do a suspend function from Room for whatever reason, and it's a regular function. In that case, Room doesn't have the ability to move it to another thread. I mean, we would, but it will be locking two threads would be users. So if you find yourself in that case, you couldn't use the dispatcher's IO or like whatever the logical IO dispatcher is in your application. But oftentimes, like just try to use suspend functions in your DAO, and then you don't need to think about this at all.
Yeah, definitely. In our guidance, what we recommend is that each class, it could be like repository or data source, should handle its own threading. So if your repository class is not doing anything with IO, it's just calling the proper database or the proper data source in this case, don't try to manage the threading for that class. The other class should be responsible for moving to the IO thread if that's the case. So let's say like you could, for example, like if you are not delegating the work to a data source and you are reading from disk, sure, like you should use the IO dispatcher there. Just only if you are dealing with that piece of functionality, you have to own the threading for your own responsibilities, not for other classes. That's pretty much what we have in the guide. Okay, now moving to the UI side of things. Next question is about what is the advised way to transport complex data from one screen to the other when we are dealing with memory-sensitive data?
Maybe I can take this one, although I'm not so sure what memory-sensitive data means precisely in this context.
Probably something like you cannot store it in disk because it's sensitive, right? Like you might not want to have it stored in room or data store, for example.
I thought maybe it was also like large data. That was the first thing that came to my mind, that you cannot parcelize.
Okay, so the way I understand it, so in the old days, very old days, you would use activity as a mediator between fragments and then make activity implement a certain interface, and then when fragment was attached to activity, you would cast this activity to this interface. But those days are long, long gone. Nowadays, a feature, a screen with appropriate view model should call use cases or repositories to update the data, and then a separate screen, a separate feature, separate view model would get notified, usually with help of flows, would get notified of those changes and react accordingly. I hope this answers your question.
You're muted. I think you're trying to talk.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, when you said we are moving to UI questions, I muted myself. I'm like, I'm done. But maybe I wasn't. But like, if this is the case about like, not that you cannot serialize the data, but it is too big, so you cannot parcel it. Take a look at the activity contracts APIs we have, like the existing ones. Oftentimes, that's kind of what they do. Like they call an API. Let's say you want an image, like that. The image is these days, I guess, like 20 megabytes. You cannot parcelize it either. What it does is it returns you a URI, a resource identifier, and then you stream it back using that URI. So you can do something similar, right? Your own contract, such that like when you're calling it, you turn this into a URI, whatever, like file path. Pass the file path to the other activity. It does whatever it wants to do, and if it wants to return something, uses the same path. So like if the data is big and you want to keep it, you have to serialize it somewhere. Otherwise, like application gets killed by the OS, you lose the data. There's no way around it. But if it is not, like as Miloš mentioned, like you can just use a view model if you don't really care about losing the data. But when you use a view model in these cases, it's more like semantically they are sharing the data, not necessarily passing it and then pulling back. They're like, this is the same data they both are able to access and modify.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, definitely take a look at the new activity contracts APIs. Yeah, pretty nice. Okay, next one is the $1 million question. MVVM or MVI for Compose?
Shall we vote? Honestly, just use what makes you happy. Both are fine. Compose is so flexible that it will work with both of those approaches and many others. There really is no no difference.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like both of them are implementations of UDF, unidirectional data flow. That is what we actually recommend in our guidance. So yeah, whatever you are most comfortable with. Like if you are TJ, probably you are like leaning towards one of the solutions, but we'll keep that secret. Although if you follow him on Twitter, you might know the answer to this.
I'm in TJ's team.
Okay, Itz, you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I mean, like it's like so you said, like whatever you know is really, really the best way to do most of these things, as long as like it follows like unidirectional data flow. There's like one requirement to use Compose properly, and we used to recommend it even before Compose, so there's nothing new. It's just that Compose kind of requires it, versus in the V world, you are like, yeah, do whatever you want. And then we saw how it went. So we don't build UI components that says do whatever you want anymore.
Yeah, it was a nice bet in the past. Cool, it worked out. Okay, next question. As projects expand, should I move domain or data layers to separate modules? Milos, maybe?
Yeah, let me take this one. As projects expand, domain data, yeah, I believe so. Yes. It's always a question whether you want to go fine-grained or whether you want to keep modules very tiny and specialized, or whether you want to make them a bit bigger. You can go full modularization and have data sources in separate modules. You can have repositories in separate modules. Or you can have your whole data layer inside a single module. There's no one single good answer for that. Although as your project grows, I would recommend keeping repositories in separate modules. Yeah, I hope this answers your question. For the domain layer, that would mean it depends whether you have use cases or not. That's also something you should consider. But basically, yes, I would recommend keeping them in different modules.
Cool. Nice. Okay. Next question. It's how should the view hierarchy be maintained to ensure an efficient app? Should the view hierarchy be as shallow as possible?
This is an interesting question too, because it's like there's a lot of these actual interesting words that you can use in different contexts. When you say shallow, what is a shallow view hierarchy? How should it be maintained to ensure an app? So I think what we've been doing is we have different like levels. For example, at least again, I'm going to use Compose in context here. We have things we call screen level composables, right? So you have a screen level composable, and then that screen level composable may have different components within it. For example, take JetNews, for example. JetNews, the sample in GitHub, has a carousel at the top, and it also has a list of articles, right? So if you were to look at the hierarchy of that main screen in JetNews, you have the screen level, and then one of the first components is that carousel, which is its own composable, and then it has the list underneath it, which is its own composable. I think when you're defining your view hierarchy, you should actually just, for everything that makes like a logical unit of UI, you should probably like extract that. Again, I'm using Compose here, works with views if you're using the view holder pattern. But for every logical piece of UI, you probably want to extract that into its own composable function. And then that way, each one is only as, each function is only as deep as it needs to be. So for example, the screen UI composable is very shallow. If this is, hopefully I'm using your definition of the term shallow properly. But the screen level UI composable is very shallow because it only has two top level composables in it, the horizontal carousel and the list. Then when you go into the horizontal carousel, it's just like a lazy horizontal, I forget what the name is, a lazy row. It's just probably a lazy row, and then it just has its own composable. So again, very shallow. So for every logical unit of UI, it should only have as much information as it needs to do its job. and that way you keep everything shallow. So extract your logical pieces of UI out, and then you keep it shallow.
I think I will let the view side of this question. So like for the views, when you had nested view hierarchies, it was oftentimes it was a performance problem. And that was because like all the view classes are out of logic, they're fairly big, and like it's harder to optimize the layout when they're very nested. So in the like if you're on the Android view system not using Compose, then this is something you need to pay attention to. Like oftentimes the core constraint layout is a good solution. Like this kind of advice is very hard to give. I remember like 10 years ago, Romain, somewhere he said use relative layouts, and it turned out everybody started converting their linear layouts into relative layout, which you shouldn't do. So the important, like the context there was like, if instead of nesting a bunch of linear layouts, use relative layouts so you don't nest them, and that's more efficient. In the Compose world, this pretty much we actually ask people to do the opposite. Like like TJ mentioned, the better you can align it, Compose doesn't. You don't pay a performance penalty, and your code is a lot more maintainable. But that's not the case for view system, unfortunately.
I think the important keyword here is recomposition when it comes to performance and Compose. Basically, one should avoid unnecessary recomposition, and there shouldn't be any penalty for nested views.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, next question. What is the best way for returning errors from other layers to the presentation layer? And the question continues saying, result CL classes is not a good solution. I remember discussing with you about this. In our guidance, we recommended using just the coroutines exception handling mechanism as a way to propagate exceptions up to the presentation layer. And we had some versions of that with the result class, and you were like, probably might not be worth it at this point. Because one of the problems, right, is that it doesn't catch all the exceptions. Like you have to be aware of the cancellation exception that could be potentially dangerous if you swallow that as well. Yeah, just using coroutines exception solution is good enough. Right, it?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I mean, you can do the result, but if you go the result path, you have this code, like in every layer, it catches the exception, turns it to result exception. Like if you're using maybe functional programming, you're using Arrow, that will be the way to go. But if you are using like vanilla Kotlin with coroutines, already has the exception mechanism to send like real errors. And this, like, you can still catch some of these in the lower layers, like if the code understands what it is and it can react to it. But if you, like, all you're doing it is like catch the exception, turn it to a result and return it, you're not really helping it. You could do it in the higher level as well. And then maybe somewhere in between, somebody understands that exception better. You're just making that code harder and more complicated for no benefit.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, for the next question, like multiple people asked the same thing, and it's about mapping. Which layers should I put domain models and mappers that map, for example, from an API to a database model?
Oh, I love this one. So
you love all the questions, TJ. What's going on?
I don't know. Maybe I'm hype. I don't know. It's a sunny day. It's spring. I don't know.
TJ got to see that.
But like, what layer should you put the domain models and mappers that map from one to the other? The answer is where it most makes sense. For example, so let's hypothetical modular application, right? So assuming you have some models that used all through the app, for example. So for lack of a better term, I'm just going to call this module core. And then you have your data layer, and then for your data layers, you have a module for your repositories, and you have another module for your network. Your network models, it's very unlikely that your UI will ever have to deal with your network models. So there's no reason for that to be in core. That should probably be defined as the network module. Then when you come to the module that has your repository, since the rest of the app is going to be consuming the data layer more or less through your repository, the mapping that maps from your network model to the external models that the rest of your app should see should really be in the repository module, because that's the only place it's going to be used. It's going to be the only place that you define it, and then you consume it externally. The reason why you don't want to put everything in a common module that everything might consume is that if that common module will be on the hot path, and if you edit that module and then you have to rebuild your application because you've edited it, you've invalidated a bunch of things, and you kind of lose all the benefits of modularization at that point. So where should you put the domain modules that maps from API to DB modules? You should put them where the mapping occurs, because that's about the only place that's ever going to be called, and you don't want to moving it anywhere else may put it on the hot path of your build, invalidating all the beautiful work you've done to modularize your app.
Cool. Awesome. Next question then. Does the UI domain data layers pattern work for non-mobile apps and Android surfaces? For example, app widgets, quick settings, notifications, Android Auto, Wear, tiles, etc.?
I believe so. In my opinion, yes. I would go in one step further. They could work very well for non-Android apps, like desktop apps, if you're familiar with KMP. Yes, this pattern is pretty universal, and I believe it would work not just for Android apps.
Yeah, but even in Android, right? For example, Android Auto, or like you have a web application, if you are sharing code base, you could also potentially share the data layer just to reuse business logic and all that. So definitely, I can see how this pattern could work for non-mobile apps. Okay, last question of the day. This is gonna be a short one, but we can discuss as long as you need it. Multiple activities or single activity with multiple fragments?
I'd imagine this one is anonymous.
Is it? Are we talking about compose or views?
Even either case, I'd imagine it's unanimous still.
Okay.
I mean,
Answer it.
you should use a single activity. I think you should. I'm trying to think of situations where I'd want to use multiple activities. I think the one time I would want to use a multiple activity is for picture-in-picture. Outside of picture-in-picture, I guess I'm going to throw the question back at you guys. What situations would you use multiple activities for?
I'll take it. The very straightforward thing is if you have multiple entries into your application, you can use activities. I think the biggest important thing to care is that if you're navigating between screens of your application, don't use activities. There is no reason. When you launch another activity, it goes to the operating system. Hey, can you launch this intent? And the operating system goes and searches. Oh, you have an activity that can handle this intent. Let me launch that activity. So you're going through the OS just to go to your next screen, and that's the only screen you want to go anyway. It's a really weird way to do it. And instead, especially with the Jetpack navigation, doing it with fragments became a lot easier. And then furthermore, especially if you are in the compose land, you probably don't even need the fragments. So it's with compose navigation, or even without using compose navigation, you don't need any of that complexity unless you want to have these entry points. So by entry point, I mean maybe the other applications in the operating system can launch your app. And so those are different activities that you want to handle cleanly. You could even avoid that, but that will get more complicated. So it makes sense to have those activities separated. So maybe think your activities as your API to the rest of the operating system. So the launcher activity, you need it because that's what the launcher uses to start your application. Is there anything else you need? Fine, put it, but otherwise you really don't need another activity in the application.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would go even one step further, go with single activity and no fragments. Or am I wrong here? I mean, with compose, it certainly can, right?
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So that was it. Thank you, everyone, for all your questions, and obviously the panelists for the great answers. If you have more questions, feel free to hit us on Twitter. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and see you next time. Bye.